Apologies for the delay, but Parliament waits for no think tank, I'm afraid. So I'm very happy to welcome Chris Skidmore, the new Vice Chair of Policy for the Conservative Party. Chris was first elected as the MP for Kingswood in South Gloucestershire in 2010. Since then he served on the Health and Education Select Committee, on the Number 10 Policy Board, as PPS to George Osborne, and more recently as Minister for the Constitution at the Cabinet Office. If you go back further, his career becomes even more aggravatingly distinguished. He's worked as an advisor to Michael Gove and David Willits. He's written for Policy Exchange, which I'll kind of gloss over slightly. He's written written several history books. He's a fellow of of pretty much everything going. In short, he is one of the really bright policy thinkers of our time, and his new mission is to try to get other people involved in that process. I'm Robert Colvile. I'm the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, which is an utterly wonderful institution. We're doing all sorts of interesting things, including our New Generation programme, where we're getting MPs from the 2015-2017 intakes, plus others, other kind of young and fresh voices to write for us. And if you're interested in learning more about the Centre for Policy Studies or supporting our work, there should be some pamphlets on your desk which tell you how to become an associate member. Can I just check that people at the back can hear? Yep, great. So the format is Chris and I will talk for about 15 minutes just to sort of get things warmed up, and then we'll throw it open to the floor because we want this to be as interactive as possible and for people to get their chance to ask questions. That said, if you have a really brilliant policy idea, even if it is the most brilliant policy idea that anyone has ever had, the best thing to do with that policy idea is to email it to the new email address, policy@conservatives.com. Because if Chris has to... which goes straight to Chris. Because if everyone is spending all of their time... If we're spending all of this evening with people essentially pitching to him and being... we're not actually going to get much of a discussion going. So it's great to say, what do you think should be done on housing? If you have specific ideas for Section 106 agreements, maybe please save that for a separate occasion. So to start off with, Chris, Vice Chair of Policy for the Conservative Party, that sounds impressive, but what exactly, as you see it and as Number 10 sees it, is your new role?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Robert, for this opportunity to come to speak to the CPS. It's actually my first speaking engagement as Vice Chair for Policy in the Conservative Party. There are 13 Vice Chairs, but don't let that put you off. I'm pretty determined to make sure that this role is quite integral to the policy-making process of the Conservative Party going forward. And certainly that was the remit that the Prime Minister set me when she invited me in to her office on the reshuffle day, basically to say that she wanted somebody to work on policy, but outside of the government. And I think that's quite an important distinction from my predecessors, who've always had a sort of Number 10 role, in that the Prime Minister would like to look at policy making in two phases. Now, one is obviously the government's manifesto programme. We haven't ditched that entirely. There still are, I think, sort of 538 manifesto commitments, of which we think there's around 470 that we can take forward. And we did win the general election. We have that manifesto to deliver. Those some policies obviously been put to one side. My role is to look at what we wish to do if we had a majority at the next general election, obviously for the purposes of what I'm looking to achieve, that is 2022. So it's putting in place a process by which we can look at how we create a manifesto for a Conservative majority government. And if I'm honest with you, and I hope I can be candid in this room, I know this is being fed also onto Facebook, but I think it's well known that the Conservative Party was scarred by the experience of the 2017 manifesto process. It was necessitated by a snap general election. Essentially, it was two men in a room writing a document at a very fast pace. And what I'm determined to ensure is that for the Conservative Party, not just for members of Parliament, but for the membership, the wider membership, and also for anybody part of that centre-right coalition, that we now spend time developing a manifesto process that will ensure we have the greatest feedback into the ideas that come out of that process, and that everyone has the opportunity to state that they were involved in the manifesto process. I've had two iterations of this in my career so far. One was as a 26-year-old when I took part as the director of the Public Services Policy Commission for Pauline Perry and Stephen Dorrell. And I learned then the risks of setting up a commission that can run for too long to produce material that can then be sort of immediately rejected. And then at the same time, several years later, I worked as deputy chair to the number 10 policy board under Joe Johnson. And again, the risks with that were that it would seem to be sort of a clique set aside from the parliamentary party. What I want to make sure is that the parliamentary party is absolutely enmeshed in the manifesto process from now on, that we work closely, with the 1922 committee backbench chairs. But we start, I think, overwhelmingly by, recognising that if we're just going to talk about Brexit, the Conservative Party will rapidly decline. If we are seen as the party simply of Brexit, I think the 2017 general election, which effectively became a by-election, tested that to destruction, is that we need to have a programme, a positive programme, to give people a reason to vote Conservative, not just not to vote Labour. It's not good enough to turn around and say, well, Jeremy Corbyn would do this, Jeremy Corbyn would do that, that this is the true face of socialism. We not only need to explain the risks of what socialism involves, but we need to make sure as a party that we set out a positive programme for the future of government that also involves making sure we don't revert to the reactionary tendencies of the right, that we tack to the mainstream, that we ensure that we can demonstrate to people that there is a narrative, and that's what I intend to do going forwards with this process.
Are there particular areas, or is there a particular target market? Have you been asked, or are you in your head thinking about a particular kind of voter or particular policy areas, or is it just a completely blank page? Because obviously it's possible to look at the election result, look and say, okay, the Tory party has a serious problem with young people. It has an almost equally serious problem with women aged sort of 18 to 45. Old people, we're probably quite good at it.
I think, hopefully we can talk about that a bit later on in the discussion, but if we started with the sort of segmentalisation of policy, I think we start asking the wrong questions. I think to start with, we want to set out as a Conservative Party that we have a new generation of MPs, and you've been already leading that process by setting up the New Generation programme, where you're having several new members writing pamphlets. But I want to be bold. I want to be able to ask questions in this policy process. There will be further announcements coming down the tracks in a couple of weeks around what that process is going to look like. But I would suspect that you would be looking at either groups of task forces or commissions being set up that would look at broad areas where we want to be in the future, post 2022, on the road to having implemented that by 2025. And that in order to do that, we need to begin that process of asking and challenging ourselves about sort of what are the questions we want to ask around taxation, around the economy, because once Brexit's happened, there'll be further divisions within the Conservative Party. We've already seen that with Nick Bowles or Rob Halfon raising issues to do with how we pay for things for the future, and then you have the challenges, which fair challenges set out in the manifesto around the ageing population, the injustices, the burning injustices the Prime Minister has set out. Those are challenges that we need to meet as part of the process. I think the flaws of the 2017 manifesto were to sort of set those challenges as the offer. What we want to do is set those challenges and those questions at the beginning of the manifesto process so that we can work through a 2 to 3 year period of boiling down the best ideas. So someone who has fought the marginal seat several times, I know that when it comes to looking at these ideas, they mean nothing if you can't explain them on the door in 2 to 3 sentences. So we want to begin that process of road testing ideas, kite flying. I think that's where my role has been set out by the Prime Minister quite clearly, is that I will be able to challenge the Prime Minister in government. I'm not there in number 10, I work with number 10, but for the future of the Conservative Party, we want to set out an agenda to say what we would be doing in government if we had that majority.
Yeah. So one of the sort of the hashtag we're using for this, and the title we use is about Tory Renewal, which is something we talked about, because the challenge here is you're not just having to come up with a manifesto policy. You're having to come up with it for a party which has been in power will have been in power in one way or another since 2010, and that's it's not quite as long as it was in 1992, but it's sort of getting on there. When we met to discuss this event, you said that one of the things you were going to go away and do was try to find examples of parties which had successfully renewed their offer in government. Have any come to mind yet? Or?
Well, I mean, it is a unique challenge. I mean, we're living in unique times. Effectively, we've returned to an age of extremes, not only in terms of policy, but in terms of demography and in terms of prosopography. When you look at the election result, we would have thought, and I certainly would have thought when I was elected in 2010 that 7 years on I would be re-elected with the highest percentage of vote share ever in the history of my constituency for a Conservative, or that the Prime Minister would have got 43% of the vote. But in my constituency, the Labour and Conservative vote share combined was 95%, and I think in the country it was about 85%. We've returned to two-party politics, and this was a challenge I remember that myself and a couple of colleagues wrote about in a book called After the Coalition that we published in 2011, making the case that if we staked out clearly the case for being a Conservative, we could rise above 40%. And we've done that, but it's still not enough because Jeremy Corbyn's managed to not only take the Labour vote, he's combined it with the Green vote and the protest vote of UKIP in a way that they've been able to create this toxic electoral coalition that doesn't stand for anything, but poses that challenge and has caused us obviously to lose our majority. But so we start from that base of having been in government for 7 years. And I think the 7 years is quite important because I think when you look at the strategy the Conservative Party took post 2016, the Prime Minister was right to come in as a new broom.
Set out a new challenge. To election in 2017, that strategy failed quite remarkably in the fact that we jettisoned our record in government. And what I would like to do is to get back to re-aggregating that record. When it comes to looking at renewal is not just about stating what you will do for the future. You've got to be able to start on a foundation of setting out what you have done in government. And what we haven't done yet as a Conservative Party is really to take our record in the coalition, to take our record under majority of David Cameron and under Theresa May, and create vertical narratives about actually what have we done for that child that was born on the 5th of May 2010. They're 7 years old now. In many parts of the country, they're 3 times more likely to go to a good or outstanding primary school. It's getting back. I know this is the historian in me. It's not good enough to just set out the statistics on a page. When it comes to colleagues in Parliament, they want to be able to stand up and debate and show human examples and be able to get on the doors and argue why we have changed lives for the better. And actually, when it comes to renewal, we've also then got to take those achievements and couple them with our failures. And there needs to be an honesty around where we have succeeded, but also with that comes the territory of where we haven't succeeded. So I think we need to be honest when it comes to looking at certain issues around welfare. While it was absolutely right that we took the decisions we took in order to be able to save money, in order to be able to live within our means. And I was just looking through the 2017 manifesto today and looking again at that critical issue of narrative. And again, what happened to the issue of the deficit? The deficit doesn't appear in that manifesto till page 61. It should have been on page 1 of the manifesto. The deficit, clearly was something that we had to work extremely hard, given it was at levels of Greece back in 2010, to reduce. It's now down to 3%. But what does that mean? It means that the Chancellor has £2.5 billion extra to spend in a way that was going off to be spent on borrowing every month. And we need to make that linkage there with our delivery of how we succeed in ensuring that money that was there just simply paying off the credit card is now being diverted into public services and is now being diverted into paying an NHS budget that has more money going into than ever before. Creating those narratives to start with is vital, but then when it comes to looking at sort of where we need to do more, I'm sure all of us, have shouted at the TV screens when we look at politicians just endlessly having to feel they've got to defend their record of success. Somehow it's a good thing that somehow an admission of failure is a weakness. I think we need to turn around and recognise that an admission of where we have not achieved is a strength, and that there is strength in that honesty. And that actually when it comes to certain issues to do with welfare, when it comes to looking at certain disability reforms, for instance, I think there are tribunals that are taking place at the moment which shows that sort of the actual implementation of the legislation has not proved as successful as what we may have hoped for.
On Monday, we announced a energy price cap to be implemented on standard variable tariffs. In effect, that's an admission that when we talked about the importance of how switching would completely sort the market out, that actually that was the answer. It wasn't, because ultimately people didn't want to switch. And so, as the Conservative Party, I view ourselves as the political wing of the taxpayer. We are the political wing of the hard-working families and those people who do the right thing in life. That when they tell us they don't want to do switch, when they tell us that they're uncomfortable actually with certain measures being taken against those people who are unable to possibly work, then I think we've got to listen. And it's that listening process also needs to take place. So phase one is building the narrative of what we've done, but also what we still need to do. And then on top of that, we can then go forward to set out where we think those future challenges are in the context, I think, of that sort of process. Because it must be a process. A manifesto cannot be an event. You can't just plonk this thing down and expect party members of parliament, candidates, to somehow go out and explain that manifesto if they are blindsided by it. And so actually, when we look at the manifesto, we've got to endlessly, like smoothing a pebble, sort of make that argument, and then make the argument time and time again. So even though we have the manifesto process beginning, I want that process to begin this year, in this next couple of months, so that we've got the time to be able to argue and to set out ourselves what are those challenges, what are the questions we need answering, how we come about sort of solving these policies. And I remember when we were in opposition, we came up with lots of great policies, but we recognised that not all of them would be delivered, even within a Conservative majority government, in the first 5 years. So Oliver Letwin set out, what will we do in 5 years, and then what would we do in the following 5 years. And so I think we need to be able to be in that timetable, but I think narratives are incredibly important and are underestimated.
So before I open this out, just one last question, which is a sort of a challenge for us as much as for you. I mean, isn't there a risk that Brexit just wipes all this off the table? That the tensions unleashed, or the divisions, or whatever deal is, it sort of reshapes the landscape in such a way that some of this becomes academic. I suppose the answer would be that it's still worth doing the work anyway. But.
I think I'm one of the reasons why I wanted to come to speak and to begin this process, and to really engage with those people who have an interest in promoting conservative ideas. It's fantastic to see so many people out tonight. It really goes, I think, to show that there is an interest in a domestic policy agenda. Is that when you look at the parliamentary party, there are, I think, easily 150 of us under the age of 45. We're often the silent majority. We don't put our heads above the parapet. We don't necessarily feel that we have to get out there and argue one way or the other an extreme case for Brexit. We know that the country voted for Brexit, that the country told us when we went knocking on doors in 2017 that, well, we've done that now, we're leaving. What are you going to tell us about the NHS? What are you going to tell us about our schools? What are you going to tell us about our local communities? And so we've got to get back onto that page of having those conversations. And I'm here tonight as a 36-year-old, father of a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, who's never spoken on Europe in the House of Commons. It's something that I never went into politics to bang on about Europe. I was on the Education Select Committee, I was on the Health Select Committee to start with. As far as I'm concerned, my interest in politics extends to actually what I call the points of contact with the state, where ordinary families, ordinary people's lives are affected by the state. How can we ensure that we make those points of contact as smooth and as effortless as possible, and also we can deliver the best value possible for money for those points of contact? For those people who think about politics for 4 minutes a week, Brexit is done and dusted. And the risk we face as a Conservative Party is certain members of the party always on television talking about this process. And Brexit is a process. And we're going through a negotiation process at the moment. And lo and behold, there will things that will happen and things will not happen. And it is driven by a media narrative that creates the high dramas, and eventually treaties and agreements are signed. But it will happen. And we'll get to the 29th of March, and we will then enter a process of transitional implementation, if you'd like to call it, and then we'll be out. And our challenge as Conservatives, I believe, is to be ready to be able to say, once we have left the European Union, That is not in itself the end of the process, the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a narrative about where we want to take Britain for the future. And I really do think there is a battle really for the soul of the country, not only in terms of the size and shape of the state, if we compare that to what the opposition would do to where we believe we want to go, but also a battle for where we want to see markets go. And obviously there will be regulatory opportunities that come out of leaving the European Union, but I want to make the case that this is, it's not some kind of panacea, that somehow leaving the EU is not going to give us everything we want. People still want to know what's going to happen to the NHS and how that's going to be funded and how their grandmother's care is going to be taken care of. They want to know how, what's going to happen to their child's school. All these things are still the bread and butter issues of politics, and if we vacate that space, there's only so much oxygen when it comes to a media narrative, when it comes to actually explaining to political columnists about sort of what our intentions are. And we need to begin now. I'm here, as just one, and I don't see myself as some kind of policy guru. I'm here to facilitate the opportunity for as many people across a network of conservative policy specialists, activists, anyone who's got an interest to get up and to begin that conversation about what we need to be thinking about doing ready for the next general election.
Which seems like a good moment to begin that conversation. So, let's start with right at the back with James from the Taxpayers Alliance.
James Price from the Taxpayers. Thank you for not focusing on Brexit on behalf of all of us. I'm sure we will hear an awful lot about it already. My question is, as boring as it is, predictable. The last manifesto you mentioned, written, you say, in a hurry, was, I think, the first manifesto from the Conservatives not to feature a tax cut since 1974 or something like that. In the time where the deficit is now coming down, there is a bit more money around to play with, as we hear. And talk about fiscal loosening as people are tired of austerity, such as it's been. Is the Conservative Party going to get back to a point, hopefully quite soon, where it realises that it can trust people with their own money, and that maybe tax cuts and that sort of responsibility for people to spend their own money more wisely than necessarily the states can? Are we going to get back to that point at some point soon, please, hopefully?
Well, I think in the 2017 manifesto there was a continuation, wasn't there, of the commitment to raise the 40% rate to £50,000 and also to continue to raise the basic rate up to, the allowance up to £12,500, what is it, £11,850?
Yes, but it didn't get talked about because it was a David Cameron policy.
Yes, and that's part of the narrative, I think, as well, obviously, where we shouldn't decouple our narrative. But you're right, when it comes to, I'm a believer in low taxation delivering the maximum possible tax yield for public services, and whether you call it the Laffer effect or whatever, being able to hit that sweet spot, I think is absolutely vital. But we will need to come up with an offer, for people if we wish to form another government in 2022. We've been through a period of not austerity, but I believe that living within our means, and people have grown tired of having sort of years of living within our means. But we still need to set out critically why we are doing this and where that is going to lead in terms of reducing that spend on credit. But I think we do need to have a retail offer, absolutely, when it comes to manifesto. And I think when you look at taxation itself, the problem we've got, I think, when you look at taxation is that there will have to be tax rises in some form for certain possible areas of public life, but it's who bears that on their shoulders. And I was thinking, it was 5 years ago when we were celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Beveridge Report, and now of the 75th anniversary of the Beveridge Report, I wrote a pamphlet for the Free Enterprise Group setting out the importance of how could we go back to a contributory principle in certain areas of welfare. And then it looked like the universal welfare state was sort of coming to an end, that it was sort of reaching a sort of point where it couldn't sustain itself. And now we've sort of gone 5 years on to getting back to sort of universalism with the sort of, Corbyn's cradle to grave approach. But I still feel that we've got to make the case for the incentive for low taxation. I remember actually it was a CPF, highly influential CPS pamphlet by Ryan Bourne, I think back in 2011, which looked at the net contribution factor of citizens, and the fact is that there were, in 2007, I think about 43% of the population received more in net benefits than they did in, sort of paying tax, and that had risen to 54% by I think 2012 it was. I'm not quite sure whether any work's been done on that, but if half the population still feel that they are receiving a receipt of state benefits as opposed to actually putting into the system, then you have a problem, because people aren't going to vote for Christmas. So it's how you rebalance that, and you're making those arguments. But absolutely, I think I instinctively believe that we should be looking how we look at low taxation. I think we should always be rewarding the base, whether that is to carry on with the personal allowance. I'm not personally sure. I think sort of we've reached a point where no one now recognises the rise in the personal allowance, that unless there's some mechanism by which people can really sort of actually illustratively see that happening. I've always personally been in favour of the basic rate myself, as that is the widest base, but how you can compensate that, you could look at how, I think, saving money off the basic rate is, I think, should personally always be the holy grail. And but I think the process of the manifesto policy group, that I hope to set up, would have an economy and taxation group in there, of which I would want that group to look very closely at the whole taxation process, and simplification of tax as well, things that we've promised in the past and that we haven't delivered on. Getting back to looking at, for instance, then even the question around hypothecated tax. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, but when it comes to communicating issues around national insurance, time and time again, you get the issue of people saying, I paid my stamps, I paid my national insurance, this is what I pay the NHS is, we all know that the NHS is not paid for in its entirety by national insurance, but how you can, communicate that fact, and maybe look at how, if there is a desire to spend more on certain areas of the NHS, and I certainly think when it comes to looking at tax rises, that there should be no tax rises without absolutely looking at the case for reform and greater efficiency. And I think so there's a real strong case, and I think polling shows that still, that people suggest they want to spend more money on the NHS, but they also want the NHS structurally still sorted out. But that's why we're here as Conservatives, why people see us as Conservatives primarily. So I think the case for looking at taxation is a strong one.
Dominic Lawson.
Yeah. Just two questions really. One is, given that the opposition is pitching itself against the market economy, what might be the policies which you would advocate, which would demonstrate the advantages? Because you talk about the energy price cap, that was an Ed Miliband suggestion. If that's the best we can do, we're not doing very well. And the other thing is, given that you don't know who the leader of the party is going to be going to the general election, how difficult does that make your job?
Well, I think, firstly, obviously, the Miliband's policy was a price freeze, which is very different from a price cap, because we still allowed...
But you're removing choice. You're basically saying we don't think you're capable of choosing things, because you don't like to choose things. So we're going, it's not a conservative choice policy.
When it comes to looking at the market, the market and the defensive markets, it's never been a greater risk. On the one hand, we have Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party looking at markets and saying they are a social ill, that they are, they're beating up the markets and saying actually your life is worse off because unfortunately you have a free market.
The latest thing is, why do you need more than one person delivering something? You've only got one letterbox, why do you need more than one company delivering post to it?
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge that we've got to face when it comes to the markets, is that there is no kind of presumed consent when it comes to looking at defence of the markets. Every generation needs to make the case for why we have markets, why individual choice will deliver the best results. But we only do that if we are able to deliver, on demonstrating, as the founder of CPS, Keith Joseph, showed, the social market value of markets, that actually with markets comes the ability to raise the living standards of the poorest in society, to be able to deliver public services. Public services that simply would not exist without the existence of business and markets in place, paying their tax. And with that does come certain constraints on the market. And I think, you know, it's not unconservative to suggest that, you know, while we are in favour of capitalism, and that we continually look to define what capitalism means in terms of the individual, who takes his capital in order to make his life better, and then to make his community better, and then to make society better. But we should also stake out very clearly that while we're in favour of capitalism, we are not in favour of corporatism.
But if you compete on interventionism, you'll lose.
Well, I think when it comes to looking at the issue of interventions, that, you know, most people would recognise that if we allow monopolies to exist, you know, we wouldn't necessarily class as interventionists to be able to break down a monopoly. When monopolies exist, that, you know, decimates choice equally. And so being able to look at that role of the state, and I think it's an important question, you know, what is the future of the state in order to be able to intervene on big organisations like Google? You know, when it comes to looking at sort of, you know, where is our choice when it comes to switching in the market, when it comes to, you know, looking at sort of digital opportunities there? You have sort of money-saving expert which can do the choice for you, but is that really your choice, or is that being sort of farmed off to another organisation that creates
Anyone can switch from
100
Google.
million?
Anyone can, I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world to go to Bing or Duck, whatever that. You know, there's all these different things. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're actually going to say to people, we're going to fix that, you're fixing something which doesn't need fixing. I mean, it's a very strange example. It's a very strange example to use, actually.
Well, not really. I think in terms of most people look at everyday lives, looking at companies that pay tax in this country or don't pay tax in this country, they're paying tax and they're turning around and saying, hang on a second, how is it acceptable that, you know, tax that should be collected in this country is not being collected? And I think if we don't recognise that fact, if we're not willing to stand up to organisations that clearly people recognise as being a problem, then we'll end up being.
That's nothing to do with monopoly. That's nothing to do with being a monopoly. I mean, yes, there is a tax issue, but that's quite separate. I mean, that's across the piece. I mean, but that's not specifically a Google thing. There's nothing to do with whether it's got a monopolistic position, which I don't think it has, in the sense that there's no obstacle to competition in that market. If someone comes up with a better search engine, people will go to it.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think the point here is that when we look, you know, we are the party of business, but we need to make sure that we clearly set out why business is working for people, why it generates the jobs that people, you know, need to live by. But at the same time, if we are seen as simply being in the pocket of big business, then that is a problem. And being able to ensure that we set out a socially responsible agenda by which we can demonstrate the market is working for people. You know, the problem is that it's not that when people look at, you know, nationalisation of the railways, it's not that they think socialism is going to work for them. They just feel that the market isn't working for them. So we need to make sure that we look at how the market can work for them.
I mean, do you think Amazon is working for people, for example?
Yes,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
But I still feel that
They don't pay much tax.
well, I think that we need to be on the side of the individual, and the individual, you know, has that ability to choose, and if they feel that is a good thing, then absolutely. But when it comes to, you know, looking at their contributions into the state, you know, I think that, you know, we have a responsibility as a Conservative Party in order to understand, you know, where people feel money is being raised in tax, and, you know, all these things have a balance to them. And when it comes to looking at establishing that narrative, if people feel that they are paying too much tax, they'll look at elsewhere to say, whereas an organisation is not paying tax. And, you know, I think, you know, on that narrative we are currently behind. And, you know, that is an admission, I think, where we've got to have the intellectual honesty to be able to look at these and challenge ourselves. And we may come up with, you know, a policy that says actually it's fine, but it's still important to have these discussions, I think.
But actually, my other question, just finally, you didn't answer
I was
my...
going to say, on the leader issue.
Oh,
Sorry, yeah.
well, I think very clearly the Prime Minister's set out, you know, a entire revamping of the CCHQ operation, of which, you know, you'll see James Cleverly taking forward sort of digital media. You know, you see Kerry Badenoch taking forward sort of looking at how we can improve our candidates in terms of BME and women representation. I think we've got a completely souped-up operation in CCHQ that is completely resilient to whoever becomes the leader of the Conservative Party. That actually what we put in place now is a machine of which I'm determined to ensure, as the Conservative Party, we take forward ideas and we begin that process. So I think the Prime Minister has set up something that is going to expand and bloom, and I think that puts us in a very good position. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done to rebuild CCHQ in order to understand the challenges that we face, not only in terms of organisationally, but in policy. The other area where I'm looking at, and to be remiss of me not to mention, is obviously when it comes to the membership. I'm really interested in how we can make sure that the Conservative Policy Forum actually has a voice, because when we look at the Conservative membership, it's not just, it shouldn't just be a membership a ticket that you have to then vote for whoever the next leader might be in a contest. If we didn't have a contest last time, but the opportunity, that shouldn't just be the only reason for membership. And I really believe in the fact that one of the things that the Labour Party has done well is to show members that they have a voice. And that if we're going to build a mass membership organisation for the Conservative Party, we've got to be able to give them the opportunity to have a voice in policy. And I'll be addressing Spring Conference on this, about how I want to strengthen CPF, how I think that we need to do more than just see CPF sending in submissions to the centre and waiting 4 months for them to come back again, and actually get out there around the country, not only as myself as covering policy, but also ministers, that we look at what events we can be putting on in order to make an offer on policy making for the Conservative Party. I'm also equally passionate about that as well.
Yeah, I'm Sheldon Wilkie. It's the first time that I've come along to the Centre for Policy Studies, and I'm very much interested in policy generally. Now, obviously, I welcome the conversation that you're going to have, because I think that post-Brexit we're probably going to need 2 years to get across new policy ideas. However, I think that there's a fundamental weakness, and this was identified by Alistair Heath in the Telegraph. Nowadays, the Tory party seems afraid of saying, well, we believe in free markets, we believe in opportunity, we believe in aspiration. You're not stating your actual beliefs as Conservatives, and I think it's underlined when you look across the board, across the think tanks like Centre for Policy Studies. You seem to have moved to the left, and you're moving in the centre ground. You need to clearly differentiate where you believe. Now, you said you were 30%.
I think quite a lot of Labour supporters would disagree with you quite vehemently.
Yeah, but but this is I think it's a valid point, because I think you said that you were 36. If you look at most of the people who are under 40, they have no idea of socialism. And I think what the weakness for the Conservative Party is you've not stated why capitalism is vastly superior. And you've allowed the Labour Party with its policies. I mean, at the moment, Corbyn's talking about nationalisation. We're going to do this, and I'm going to spend more money on universities, open the tap. You have to, as well as having a conversation, you've also got to restate what you believe in. And the final point I would make is you fudged the issue of the National Health Service. You really need to have an honest discussion. If you look at some of the people, and I'm quoting a think tank, the IEA, one of the people who deals with health policy, who's involved, Katie Andrews, all right? She was very, I'm just speaking, I have no connection with the IEA, by the way. But you need to have perhaps a Royal Commission or something and really talk about the alternatives.
Well, a Royal Commission is, of course, a CPS policy.
Yes, I know. But I realise that. But I think
sorry.
more open on it.
To be honest, I think everything you've said, I don't disagree with. I think absolutely that when it comes to being clearer about our values, and we're at 43% when it came to the general election. Ultimately, we need to break, I imagine, about 45%. We're at this stage now where we are at this sort of two-party politics that we've got to go for broke. When it comes to stating our purpose as Conservatives, people, I think, recognise that there is now a clear choice. You can't fudge this issue. You can't then sort of flee off to UKIP on the one hand or Liberal Democrats on the other. You are now Labour or Conservative, and we've got to be able to try and win some of those Labour voters back. I think who maybe voted in protest at that election period. And being clear about the destination of the country, I think is absolutely important. I caution against being too negative about Jeremy Corbyn and about the risk of socialism. I don't think necessarily that sort of just saying, oh well, we're not going to be this, it will work. We do need to set up that positive vision. I think you're right on that. On the NHS, I'm not so keen on the idea of a royal commission myself. I think sort of history demonstrates, I think, that it is a sort of kicking the can down the road sort of moment. I mean, when you look at sort of previous royal commissions, that sort of in the late 70s, they never really resolve the issue of what we need to do for the future. That's not to say though that we shouldn't be having the debates that a royal commission itself might want to engender. That there are those huge challenges around the ageing population. There are those huge challenges around looking at particular operations in the NHS.
But isn't the problem here that you said very honestly at the start there are issues on which the Conservatives haven't done as well as they should, and you mentioned welfare. I mean, if we're being honest, Andrew Lansley's NHS reforms were one of those problems, and it had, and one of our arguments is that has made it very, very, very difficult indeed for any politician, especially a Conservative politician, to then come forward with their own ideas about the NHS.
I think one of the issues with obviously Lands's reforms, and it's still a cyclical argument, is that somehow the bedpan clanging down the corridors of Whitehall can supposedly be heard, and that sort of somehow people feel that any issue or problem within the local hospital can suddenly be addressed by the Secretary of State. And breaking that sort of linkage is proving increasingly difficult, and Lands's reforms were meant to sort of separate that out with NHS England. They just in the end created an incredibly largest public body, or quango, of all time. And we have obviously CCGs that sort of operate in various degrees of success. But it's not to say that the kernel of the idea, I think, is one that is worth investigating, which is where we go around the local agenda for healthcare, about sort of local responsibilities for healthcare funding and delivery. And obviously we've seen Manchester and Andy Burnham be able to take on certain responsibilities when it comes to healthcare. I think there is an open door, or a space there, with looking at actually how we can better align healthcare spending as well as delivery locally, not just in terms of CCG level, but sort of across a mayoral authority level, for instance, particularly when it comes to social care.
Yeah, so we've got quite a lot of questions, so I'll try to run through them. So the lady at the back, also not quite at the back, yes.
Thank you. I'm a bit of an alien here. Mary Dejevsky, I write the Independent and occasionally the Guardian. I wonder, you sounded in your breakdown very confident that you've got the oldie vote in the bag.
That was me, to be fair.
Right. I mean, are you so confident? And are you worried that maybe if you pivot towards the youth vote, you're actually going to lose the bedrock of support?
I think going back to the 2017 general election, and you look at the sort of breakdown in the voting base, actually, the 2017 general election, I think, wasn't necessarily lost by a surge in a so-called youth quake that sort of didn't actually really take place when you look at the numbers. It was people over the age of 60 not turning up to vote. I mean, a lot of seats, when you break it down, it's not people voting Conservative, voting Labour that makes the difference. It's people on either side not coming out to vote and sitting on their hands. And I remember canvassing in my constituency, and a gentleman running down the road to sort of say, almost to Skidmore, I voted for you the past two general elections, but I'm not voting for you now. He said, I've spent 40 years working hard to buy my house, and it's the one thing I've got to give to my daughter. And if you think that I'm voting for you so that you can take that away from me, if I've got... And I said to him, well, sir, you do realise that currently that you keep £100,000, and at the moment it's £23,000, 500. So, no, it's not. Don't tell me that. The communication of that policy is that people didn't simply know that the current situation that exists, which points to a wider problem demographically. But I think that points also, we talk about the intergenerational divide, but it's equally important, I think, to look at sort of when it comes to why people take the decisions they do to vote, they don't often necessarily take it for their own personal welfare. They're often thinking about those generations, behind them. And that experience of that gentleman, showed me very clearly that it comes to looking at social care policy. It's not just about social care. It is about that individual story and life and aspirations for the future of his family. And we're going to have to, I think very carefully about that. And that's why I think building those vertical narratives and working out where electoral success lies in actually building constituencies of voters. Now we can go back to the segmentation. I think is important. I'm not a believer in somehow sort of transactional voting of just having goodies for the sake of it. I don't believe in votes at 16, for instance. I think that somehow that's going to win us, a legion of young voters if we somehow think, oh, we'll give you the vote. But what we've got to do, I think, is create a panorama of a vision and policy ideas that we can hang off that will appeal to all generations. If not, why are we here? The Conservative Party is meant to be here for all voters. We're not simply here targeting a sort of certain segment of the electorate.
So, Matt Warman.
Thanks, Robert. I think for me, Jeremy Corbyn's sort of straightforward, economically illiterate populist. And the question for our next manifesto has to be how, in an age of populism and post-truth and all of that, how do we sell an intelligent, nuanced, economically literate manifesto? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on not only what you're going to come up with, but also how you're going to present it and sell it to a public that we know is increasingly drawn towards stuff that is very, very, very much one-dimensional.
So I should say that Matt is one of the fine body of Tory MPs contributing to our New Generation project.
And partly, I think, when it comes to communication, it is about repetition, and that's why I think beginning the process now, I hope, this is sort of not betraying any confidence like that, we will get the process in place where we'll have, forms of task forces, commissions in place that then will be able to produce interim reports, final reports, boiling down to a single document. That document, programme for government or whatever, will then be taken forward as white papers or green papers going forwards. But I want that process to begin now, so that we can have those discussions, whether in private or whether in groups such as this, to be able to make sure that no one feels that they didn't participate or have that opportunity to participate. And then I think it is about sort of constantly getting out there and reinforcing certain messages and looking at how we frame those policy ideas in ways that we can, the medium is the message when it comes to policy. Policy is half the battle, is about communicating. It isn't about the statistics, it isn't necessarily about the policy as a concept, it's about making sure you can get out and demonstrate to whom you're selling it and to why it's going to be enacted. So yeah, I'm very keen that when we look at that, that we have a process by which we boil down ideas, we come up with as many ideas to start with, we put those out there, and above all, to get back to that positive and optimistic feeling that I remember when I got involved in politics, as in my mid-20s, Cameron was such a breath of fresh air because we were listening. And we were not only listening to party members, we were listening to groups in society we had listened to for a long time, and it felt, a great time to be a Conservative. That actually, obviously, we've been in opposition for a long time. That we were coming in as a new group, but I still think that we can get back to that. And actually, the B word Brexit, does I think provide that opportunity in terms of a reboot.
But to push back on Matt's point, it's really hard to compete against a party which is offering everything to everyone, and the rich people will pay for it. I mean, on tuition fees, say it's quite hard to compete against free. I mean, is there how can you do that beyond just being?
Well, I think that's where looking at the sort of balanced narrative of fiscal responsibility, of looking at sort of the party that has the best interests of all generations, and tone. And I think when we come to Matt's point about populism, is absolutely right. One of the worst thing we could do is to look at revolutionary populism and to replace it with reactionary populism. And there are tendencies in the Conservative Party that would push the other way, and it's our responsibility as legislators, as elected members of the Conservative Party, as Conservative Party members, as members of the centre-right, who I think being in the middle, holding that centre ground, whatever, it is hard. But we have a responsibility to be able to not listen to those siren calls on either side of the debate, that somehow we can pay for something if only we did this, and those sums don't add up. But that's why that process needs to begin now. We need to make sure that we can get out there, and by the time we get to the future general election, we want to make sure, with our sums having been done, that we have the sound bites and the statistics in place that every Conservative MP will be able to feel confident repeating those and having sort of almost learned them by rote.
The gentleman there has been very patient.
Thank you very much. My name's Sam Hooper. I blog at Semi-Partisan Politics. I think it's really good that we're having events like this talking about Conservative renewal now. My fear is that it'll all be for nothing if you don't realise that Britain's now in a period of kind of political discontinuity. So, the same old policies, the same policy solutions don't command public support anymore, and neither really do they work either. I think if Brexit, if Donald Trump, if the rise of Jeremy Corbyn have taught us anything, it's that people are sick of what were perceived as the standard centrist policies, the kind of centrist consensus that was emblemised by David Cameron and Tony Blair and so on. I think the sentiment, the CPS did great work in the 70s because they came out with the Stepping Stones report, and rather than just looking at things in silos, saying, well, we've got a housing problem, we've got a productivity problem, X, Y, Z. It said, what's the problem with Britain? How are these interlinked? How do the problems link together? How do we come up with a suite of mutually supporting policies that will work together to solve the problems that we face? And I think we need to do something like that that's more integrated. I think there's a lot of good work going on. There's, the Big Tent initiative going on. Nick Bowles is doing good work. We've got the new generation here, which is really good as well. But, the future is going to belong to the party that recognises that, we face new, unique challenges, globalisation, automation, how do we change our education system to produce graduates and diploma holders that, can do the jobs of the future. We need to look at these bigger things, and, it's not just enough to sort of respond to yesterday's negative headlines. You need to have a more strategic approach, I think. And I think, personally, a new Stepping Stones report for 2022, whenever the next general election is, would be something that's really good. I think it would be a really good initiative that draws together all the good work that everyone else is doing. So I don't know if that's something that would be of interest, but I think, it's something we need to do.
I would, say echo, but don't disagree with your points. I remember being in opposition, working with Michael Gove, Dominic Cummings, somehow getting a copy of John Hoskins' original sort of handwritten sort of stepping stones report. We were very interested in it then, and I'm still interested in that strategic approach. Thank you for reminding me of it, actually, because I think there is that challenge also, though, about what do you do towards building towards the next gen election versus, say, where will we be with AI? I mean, these things George Freeman is particularly very interested in, but sort of how you then take those challenges. This, again, was one of the issues with the 2017 manifesto. It set out certain challenges. It set out a sort of new five giants, sort of referencing Beveridge. But some people don't, they don't want to face some of the challenges because they look scary, or that somehow that sort of by posing those challenges that it appears a negative vision of the future. So there's a question there about absolutely facing those challenges and creating, as you say, that strategic stepping stones thing. But also there's a separate challenge in making sure that those challenges in themselves don't communicate to somehow, the future's going to be bad and we're all going to be sort of run by robots. And sort of how do you get out of that box as well, I think is also something that we need to look at.
Ollie,
John Strafford. Chris, if you're looking at the process of policy development, what you need to do is to get the party members to buy into that process. Because if they do buy into it, then they become advocates for whatever policies emerge. And they no longer believe it when politicians say to them that we're going to consult with you or you have influence. The thing that they believe in now is voting. So why didn't the chairman of the policy forum voted and elected a position by all party members at an annual general meeting of the party using online voting as well? Why don't we have, when they put in forward policies, votes on those policies? And why don't we have at the party conference motions for debate, in which the party genuine motions for debate, on which there are votes taken, so that party members are involved in this whole process, and perhaps If we actually allow them to be involved and to participate, because that's what people join political parties for, perhaps we will reverse the catastrophic decline that we've had in party membership to date.
Well, I think, without wanting to, I'm not in. I have regular discussions with Brandon about sort of what he wants to do as chair. Obviously, he's got his own ideas, but I think
Party members elect him.
the issue with the policy, I clearly recognise that we can and we must do more to be able to allow members to have a say. What form that takes, my intention is to do a tour around the country, that I'm basically going to look at actually speaking to as many, not only CPFs, but sort of put on meetings where CPF members from various constituencies can come to meet with me and discuss this, and then to report back at conference about some proposals that I hope to take forward. But I'm quite clear that I think we need to look at how we look at policy making, not just on a national level, but also at a local level. And I used to be George Osborne's parliamentary private secretary, and he would have MPs in all the time to discuss sort of regional issues. Obviously, there was a financial aspect there when it came to sort of treasury spending. But I still think that when it comes to looking at policy, a lot of people, when we've got local elections coming up, how do councils put together local manifestos? How can we work as a party to help them with that? And then there's the devolution aspect as well. So there are manifesto processes that are underway that are also equally local as well as national, making sure that we are listening to the local agenda, because housing need in South West is very different from the North East of England. Yet at the moment, all members are then expected to sort of feed into a paper on housing policy, and does that really work? And that's what I want to ask the members, to sort of say, is there a way in which we could be looking at a far finer grained way of how we deliver policy and how we listen to members and learn from their lived experience of actually being a constituency. When it comes to, for instance, white papers, green papers, why are we not sort of organising Skype sessions with ministers to sit in and get the CPFs to then actually respond to the green papers that are actually sort of being put out there? When it comes to the fishing paper, for instance, why aren't we asking all the coastal constituencies to feed into that? Why are we asking them about inner city housing? So I think there's interesting challenges there about sort of that feedback and how we can build that to be more effective and then make the most of our members' expertise.
So we've got about 15 minutes left and loads of people want to ask questions, so I'm going to try and do that thing of bunching them into groups of 3 people so that Chris can answer a batch at a time. So Ollie.
The fact that the leader of the Labour Party is Jeremy Corbyn and not a much less sort of scary prospect like Ed Miliband or someone else. My question is, how does that change the sort of psychology and strategy of formulating policy, whether it's in the short run or the long run? So the fact that the stakes are so high, does that change the policies that you are choosing?
And then,
Christopher Montgomery, PRG, you said the party mustn't return to the reactionary tendencies of the right. Which tendencies do you have in mind? Can you describe them in any detail, and do you think they've had any salience whatsoever for voters since 2009?
well, let's get answers to those.
Okay. Well, I think sort of taking the first question and returning to the first one after that. It's all about tone, and it's particularly when it comes to our response to Brexit and people saying why people voted to leave the European Union. Looking for those answers who we are leaving, but to somehow then couple that with ideas of somehow the Good Friday, removing ourselves from the Good Friday Agreement, or somehow attacking the civil service as being somehow trying to block Brexit. I think that sort of tendencies there, I think, are unhelpful, and I think sort of we've got to be cautionary about how we approach Brexit, if that's sort of going to allow a particular faction of the party to then dominate with certain viewpoints in the future. I don't necessarily believe that sort of while we are leaving the European Union, it doesn't then give everyone a carte blanche to then suddenly sort of come up with sort of quite hardline ideas.
I'm sensing Jacob Rees-Mogg would not get your endorsement in a leadership contest.
Well, I think that there clearly is now a populist appeal to those people who say what they think, and we are now, and I'm saying what I think tonight. I'm hoping I'm sort of being sort of fairly candid with you as far as I can be. But just because you have that age of authenticity does not in itself, bind itself to responsibility, and we've still got that responsibility to be able to spend taxpayers' money wisely, to be able to deliver for the poorest in society, to be able to stand there, you know, in government saying what we're going to do for the whole country rather than a certain segment of the country. And so I do genuinely feel that, you know, we've got to make sure that when it comes to defending, you know, our record as Conservatives, we've also got to make sure we defend our ability as Conservatives to act on behalf of everybody and to be able to act moderately as well. So, you know, in terms of sort of, I think that's quite important, because if we see Brexit as simply being some kind of Brexit that's going to lead to sort of, you know, an extremist approach to all other policy areas of making, I think that there is a real sort of crossroads here, and when it comes to, you know, looking at the future of the Conservative Party, we want a modern, dynamic Conservative Party to be setting out a future generation of how we're going to make Brexit work for future generations, how we're going to sort of capitalise on the amount of money that we'll be able to spend, but also on the, you know, the regulations that sort of will fall away, and at the same time make sure that we're not just talking about Brexit, because that's not where the country is, and we've got to be able to step out of that Brexit box. And I know it's really difficult when most of the legislation going through sort of Parliament is all about Brexit, all that, you turn on the TV, it's all about Brexit. But, you know, there are certain members of Parliament who obviously have spent the last 30 years, and this is their raison d'etre, but it's not the raison d'etre of many Conservative parliamentarians. And we've got to get out there talking about public services, we've got to get out there talking about housing need, we've got to get out there talking about, you know, what we're going to do for the future of the country, and show that we are, you know, pointing towards the 21st century rather than back into the 20th century.
And on Corbyn?
And on Corbyn, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the game has changed, that we were complacent, and that, you know, we thought that we were going to win that election hands down, and that we'd have that majority. And when you look through, you know, the manifesto, we based that on a premise that we were going to have a landslide. And, you know, the British public aren't stupid, and I think quite a few of them turned around and said, well, you know, Chris, you'll be fine, you're going to win by a landslide, and therefore I'm going to vote Labour, because I just feel that sort of, you know, maybe the tone you're taking is not the right one. And I don't necessarily feel that they did that thinking that sort of, you know, we were going in the wrong direction, but I think that sort of, you know, when it comes to that snap election, it did become a by-election. It then became about other areas of domestic policy rather than just Brexit. People, you know, not even 9 months on for the referendum, were fed up by Brexit. The game's changed, and we've got to admit that that game has changed. When you look at the number of marginal seats now we had, it's not just the fact that, you know, we've lost our majority, it's the fact that we had 60 seats, of which I think they were all above a buffer of 3,000, you know, majority, and now actually that's crashed right down, and there's maybe 40 seats within a sort of 2,000 majority. I mean, it's so tight. It's, you know, we've gone back to that when Tony Blair had that majority in 2005, where he had a 60-seat majority, but obviously it was a sort of wafer thin, with I think only 14,000 votes swinging it in England at that particular time, spread across some marginal seats. So, you know, we can't carry on thinking that somehow, you know, Corbyn isn't a threat, and that I think the operation that is underneath Jeremy Corbyn also is incredibly ruthless, and they know what they're doing, and that we need to match that, and that, you know, they are setting out a agenda that we think, you know, may not have much sense, but we've got to understand, you know, why people think that that agenda is something they want to vote for, and now we've got to combat that, you know, policy for policy.
So the gentleman is back, and then the well, and then.
Hi, sorry, Alex Turner, hi Chris.
Hi Alex, good to see you.
My question is a tactical one. I think David Cameron very successfully delivered a series of quite important papers in opposition: Quality of Life, Economic Efficiency, Health, Global Outlook, and they signposted our way really to power. I guess, what can we learn from that? Because there is a risk if we hold all our best cards back till 2022, might be a bit late. I know we're obviously talking about involving the party, which is very important, but I also think one of the things that Dave did quite successfully was that all of those papers were very outward looking, and they gave the country a real taste of what a future Conservative government would do.
And then Chris.
Chris Glennie, just talking about, you know, the people smoothing the pebbles, as you mentioned earlier, which I like as a term of phrase. Do you think that it's possible to prepare for the next manifesto effectively when there aren't that many exciting policies being enacted now? For example, you look at the article in the Evening Standard today talking about Michael Gove, the impact he's made there, and how quickly good ideas get out and capture the public imagination. It doesn't feel like enough people are smoothing the stones in the agenda ahead of you to really show that Conservatives have got both imagination and the wish to do something in government. And if you then, however good your manifesto is in 2022, haven't actually shown your hunger to get things done in government, that will make it extremely difficult to actually make the case however good the ideas are.
So in a way, the same question.
This was a question I posed to number 10, James Marshall, and to Chief Whip, to sort of say, well, would you like me to do policy work on the programme as it stands at the moment, or do you want me to look at something that is discrete and that works towards the next general election? And actually what's begun to sort of take place at number 10 now is sort of, there are strategic meetings that are taking place. I go to them where the ministers from each department come in to sit down with the party office staff to then look at actually their programme. And I saw this in the Cabinet Office, civil servants will obviously never sort of look at the political advantages to certain sort of legislation that are taking place. But Michael Gove is a case in point. He has skinned a statutory instrument on microbeads about sort of 10 different ways to be able to sort of create this sort of real sort of visible policy announcement. And obviously he was helped by Blue Planet as well, and his timing was excellent. But that was something he was able to do that was secondary legislation. Obviously we're in a place now where we're sort of told there's no primary legislation for the foreseeable future, certainly not for this sort of Queen's Speech period into May 19, because of the Brexit programme. And that's obviously sucking oxygen out of the room as much as it is on the watching TV programmes talking on the news about Brexit. So the legislative space has disappeared, but there are still opportunities to be able to take through small pieces and go to demonstrate that. And that's, I think, responsibility. Well, number 10 wants to look at actually how we can really clearly get our communications working better to be able to really highlight what we're doing. That actually, there are things that we are doing in government that are Brexit, that we do have a domestic agenda. We just need to get better at actually highlighting when things are going through the Commons, what are we doing, and also what is not legislative that we can do. And it gets back actually to Alex's point around sort of say there's documentations, but those signposting moments. All it could be is that I still remember when I was Ian Duncan Smith doing the Easter House speech. Now that sort of, I can't remember what he said in the Easter House speech, but I can just remember the fact that he went up to Easter House in Glasgow just seems to be a seminal moment in the history of the Conservative Party at that time. And so I think there are similarly points where we can look at sort of how we deliver speeches, where we deliver speeches, what events we put on, what documents we want to put out there. Sort of, I think Greg Clark was rather unfortunate with the sort of publication of the industrial strategy. Prince Harry then got engaged on the same day, didn't he, as the publication of the industrial strategy. But there'll be opportunities to return to that in sort of several white papers. I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right by looking at sort of white paper, green paper process. We can sort of build a momentum in setting out sort of what we're going to do, even if this Queen's Speech period we can't legislate on some of the things. But message is key. And what I'd like to do going forward with the manifesto process is have a series of groups that are set up looking at economy, public services, global Britain, infrastructure, publishing reports, publishing interim reports, publishing final reports, and then once a final document's been produced that is a sort of essentially a programme for government, you get into that implementation phase of where you then start producing those documents that I remember I wrote the schools one for Michael Gove, setting out how we were going to convert all schools to academy status. And those were sort of coming out then, once a month, I remember it was gridded. And having that discipline, is incredibly important because people forget. And you've just got to remember until you're sick of the policy idea that so you just got to keep on repeating it so that actually the manifesto, the final document, in itself, is something that everyone should be completely familiar with by the time it comes to the sort of election period. Obviously, you probably want to hold back things that might be sort of newsworthy in terms of goodies, as it were. But absolutely, communication, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here today is to begin that communication process. Is to demonstrate that there are people like myself and other MPs, and you know, the younger generation of MPs are going to be critical in being involved in this process. I'm going to make sure it's very much seen as sort of, you know, new MPs who will be sort of leading these groups, that we get out there, we get around the country, that when it comes to taking evidence, for instance, you know, that in itself signals a opportunity, an intent, an ability to want to listen to certain groups, and that we can't just be taking evidence in London, and as much as, you know, attractive venues like this and think tanks, you know, we've got to get out of Westminster, we've got to get around the country, and we've got to make sure that sort of, you know, out of those evidence sessions, I will be requiring a certain, you know, number of those, over half, to be taking place, you know, around the country outside of London as well.
But presumably think tanks should still continue publishing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when it comes to, you know, the centre-right think tanks, you know, some are more aligned to the Conservative Party, some are not, some are charities, and some obviously, you know, are making specific cases for free markets or for social markets. I want to make sure that all think tanks that are involved, and that we actually, with that challenge of socialism, you know, facing us, you know, with the stakes being as high as they are, how can we all pull together to make sure that we're not sort of just suddenly attacking the government for somehow producing a Diet Coke version of the full-fat version that we wanted, but instead that actually we are working together, gridding our, you know, your papers, other papers, so that actually when it comes to the publicity and trying to build the sort of domestic policy ideas getting out there, that, you know, we don't cross over each other. And so that's, I think, another part of the sort of Conservative policy network. I'm really keen to sort of try and make sure that sort of think tanks have their voice heard and can equally put the fight out there. You know, I don't think CCHQ can do it alone. You know, I think the CPS's work on water nationalisation, for instance, you know, got a tremendous reaction both in the press and was sort of picked up, you know, as a wider narrative. And I think that's great that sort of think tanks are able to, you know, put that out there, because if it's CCHQ press are going to say, well, you would say that, Tories, wouldn't you? You know.
I mean, so John McDonnell will say that. But, sorry, the lady there and then the lady there.
Tanya with Twickenham. Just asking you, I like your idea of what have we done for the child born 2010, but bearing in mind that child would have come across NHS workers and education workers, do you see the next manifesto highlighting, I know you don't want segmentation, but highlighting something for them, and it would be part of that B word, the Brexit word as well?
Well, I think there is that sort of discussion at the moment with the Conservative Party about sort of focusing on the NHS and not focusing on the NHS, and sort of what we should be sort of looking. I think we have to. I think that sort of the NHS is such, you know, seminal institution, and it is an institution, and as a Conservative Party, you know, we should be defending institutions as much as we should be defending markets. And actually, you know, someone who's the son of a nurse, I recognise that, you know, when it comes to nurses, they are also working mothers, that actually we should be looking at sort of not just NHS policies, but also what underpins those people working in NHS and the childcare opportunities that they should have. But we have lost ground. I mean, when you look at things like the junior doctors contract, I mean, that probably had quite devastating effects on our vote in 2017, particularly among certain ethnic populations. And I think going back to understanding that there are people in the NHS who shouldn't ultimately, you know, we shouldn't think, oh, they're automatically vote Labour because it's the NHS. Winning them back, because, you know, they earn salaries, they pay tax, they use other public services. You know, really, I think sitting down and talking to those groups, I think it's trying to rebuild trust. I think is very important.
Okay. So I think we probably have, I'm getting signals from the back of the room that we have time for one last question. So the lady there still wants to ask a question. But hopefully Chris will still be able to hang around and have a glass of wine and answer any individual questions afterwards. So.
Hey, I'm Chloe. I was just going to ask, given the kind of like very real threat of socialism and also a kind of our dwindling party membership as well, is it time for us to be reaching out outside of our party? Just in terms of, there's an awful lot of capitalists being bullied out the Labour Party, and for people that are kind of under 30, there's so many of them that they are fundamentally believe they're not socialists and they're so much more in line with us and our values, but I don't think they think that we're listening to them or we're giving them any kind of, we're not listening to their concerns about capitalism or just in general. Is it time we really made an effort to kind of reach out outside the party for policy ideas, I think.
Yeah, and I think there is that balance because we do need to reconnect with party members, and I think post the 2017 manifesto, I really want to make sure that the next process is transparent, that basically everyone knows what is going to happen, and that sort of people can recognise what is going to sort of be produced at the end of the process. When we did the Cameron policy commissions, I remember at the time there was a sort of degree of uncertainty when those commissions then were published. Was that Tory policy? Was it not Tory policy? They hadn't, when they were set up, they were sort of set up in haste to the point where that caused sort of party difficulties because you had sort of Zach Goldsmith producing his reports, you had sort of Pauline Perry, Stephen Dorrell producing their reports. They had particular sort of expertise. John Redwood, and the CSJ, and sort of, and we've got to make sure we don't, I think, set ourselves in a position where we raise expectations to the point that sort of the documents that are produced to start with, the interim reports or then the final reports or then the final manifesto policy. But I do think that when it comes to this opportunity to renew, and it is about talking about renewal, and I said, getting back to that honesty about saying where we've gone wrong, where we can do more, where we've got a new generation, as I said, the advantage of the 2017 and 2015 generation, with the elections taking place, is we've got sort of new blood in the Tory party, that we have that opportunity to say, we're coming onto the stage, and as the next generation, we recognise the challenges that you're telling us, and how we do that. I mean, that's the point I made to Dominic, I think, whereas he was sort of taking that point around the issue of markets and monopolies, that often, as a Conservative party, we can look at numbers on a page and we can rationally argue the point, but still people are concerned about the dominance of Google, or they are, and so therefore, while things may not be sort of technical monopolies, they're still monopolies in people's eyes, and we have a duty, I think, to listen and to recognise, not only empathising, but also acting upon that. How we do so, if you've got any ideas, do let me know, because obviously I think the evidence gathering process will be key, that it's not just from experts and organisations that have worked in relevant policy areas, but it's also making sure we get to the coalfaces, to the NHS workers, and get out there into the regions. If one thing, I think, for me, Brexit, that sort of, when you look at sort of the regional aspect of the challenge we face now, there's going to be huge accountability issues, I think, on the back of when we finally leave the EU. We're still in a place where, at the moment, we can argue that we can't do X, Y, and Z because of the EU, and we've been in a place as politicians where we've been making that argument for the past, 30 years. Certainly, I've been involved in politics the past 15 years. We've always said, oh well, of course we'd love to do that, but the EU doesn't allow us to do this, doesn't allow us to take VAT off tampons, etc., etc., etc. But we're going to have that accountability restored to us. And that accountability, can either lie at the centre in Westminster, with all the problems that it creates between this sort of court versus county divide, the problems that are still replicated in the US that Trump seems to so successfully thrive off of, sort of, draining that swamp, that actually, we've got a responsibility to look at how we listen to those voices. Now, is that an emotional response where it's just about communication, and we've talked about the challenges of communication and having better communication processes? Absolutely. The longer term point is actually around what does the future and structure of government look like, and how we make sure that government's more responsive at a day-to-day level on those points of contact and in the regions as well. So I think part of the the groups I'd like to set up is looking at the issue around sort of the individual and the community, and sort of how we can make sure that we have the ability to listen, because I think the challenges that we'll face post-Brexit, it will sort of only magnify.
Well, thank you very much to Chris Skidmore. I hope you've all had a very good time, and there should be some drinks at the back for anyone who wants to hang around.